Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don. Welcome. And today is Tuesday, and I'm going to continue my something less than diplomatic discussion of diplomacy today. I hope that you enjoyed yesterday's discussion. A number of people said that they did. And, I have to say that I am continuing to talk about issues of leadership and politics because mostly of the reaction I'm getting from people. I'm having people tell me that they're enjoying it, and I'm seeing effects in the wider community of things that I'm bringing up. So I guess I need to continue talking about it. If you've followed my work for any number of years, you'll know it's not my preferred topic to talk about. I love to talk about metaphysics. I love to talk about the witchness of the why. If you followed my vlogs, you'll know that I did sometimes talk about this kind of issue, but not for the most part. But I think that we're at a point that a lot of these things need to be said. Now, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you know that you can type your questions or comments into whatever platform you're watching on. They'll show up here in my chat room, and we'll be able to talk directly. And hello to Cassandra in the chat room. And Cassandra says, I only caught some of it yesterday, but I enjoyed what I was here for. And, the broadcast is always available afterwards. So you can go back and see the rest of it if you wish to. And hello to Janet Winston in the chat room. It's good to see you, Janet. We take great pride in the fact that our video offerings have remained available for as much as 20 years now. And our little daily live broadcast of Midday with Reverend Don is still available on pretty much any of the platforms it shows up in, and in particular at CorellianTV.com. And hello to Mary Hawk in the chat room. And, we've been doing this for a long time, and we've had the privilege of covering a lot of historical occasions, of talking to a lot of historical people. And all of that video is still there for you. That really isn't part of today's conversation, but it is something that I think is worth remarking on. Many of the people that I have been privileged to interview over the years are no longer living in this world. They will give no further interviews, but you can still see them on Corellian TV. All of the rituals that we've covered happened only that one time, but they're preserved in video, and you can still see some of these formidable people coming together. In ritual circumstances, you can see workshops that they offered, that they allowed us to videotape. You can see all sorts of things. And we regard that as a historical document that we hope will endure. And although that may not immediately seem to be part of a conversation on leadership, it is in its way. In terms of my personal path, that role of documentation and preserving our history was always very important to me, always very important to Ed the Pagan, and we made that happen. And, there were other people out there documenting some of these things, usually not in video, but in other ways, but find their documentation today, and it's not so easy. I often talk about my early days in the pagan press, and I remember a lot of fascinating people whose names younger people will never have heard. And try to find their articles, try to find any interviews they may have done. It would be very difficult. How many of you have heard the name Donna Lyon Rose? How many of you have heard the name Bill Hines? These were major contributors to the pagan press, but their voice is gone today for the most part. Hello to Renee in the chat room. It's good to see you. Some others, like Gray Cat, are a little better remembered. Um, but a lot of those things just went by the wayside because no one preserved them. And we believe preserving history is very important to the future. Hello to Arlene in the chat room. It's good to see you. And last week we were revisiting last year's ninth convening of the Parliament of the World's Religions for exactly this reason, to keep that memory alive, to remind everyone what a wonderful event it was, to remind Corellians what a wonderful presence we had at that event. And hello to Janet Gann in the chat room. It's good to see you. And we could do that because we photographed and videotaped so much, or I should say videoed. But I'm old and I still think in terms of videotape, even though no one has been using videotape for a long time. But we videoed a great deal. And therefore, we were able to bring it back to you. And you can access that in our archives at any point. Now, today, I wanted to continue talking about diplomacy. But I think the first thing I'm going to point out about diplomacy is that everything I've just said is also about diplomacy. Being a person who is acting as a journalist in this community is a very diplomatic position. You might not think of it that way, but it is. And hello to Jason in the chat room. It's good to see you, Jason. And hello to Academy to all Folkomheit. It's good to see you. When you are preserving history, you can do it in different ways. But if you're really trying to preserve it, you're going to do it in a diplomatic way, and across the board. And there are people that I have interviewed, people whose events we have covered, who were not all people I was on good terms with. But you'll never know looking at our coverage. We did not use it in that way. If we covered it, we did so in goodwill. And that is a kind of diplomacy. Being a journalist also opens doors, another aspect of diplomacy. And, it's rare that anyone doesn't want to promote whatever it is they're doing. And if you're the person offering that promotion, you're in a very diplomatic position, and a position that is very beneficial to everyone. So let us, Academy goes on to say that this is German for Academy of All Perfection. That's wonderful. I want to review our definitions from yesterday that I am using for the purpose of this discussion. And that is first, that politics is the art of avoiding violent confrontation, whether emotional violence or physical violence. A lot of people confuse politics with infighting and with emotional violence. And this is a very serious mistake. And when you make that mistake, it condemns you to ending up in a position of emotional violence because you've ruled out all the things that prevent it. Politics was discovered and perfected as the way of avoiding, particularly in cities, open confrontation. And it is largely the art of compromise and diplomacy. And diplomacy is the art of convincing people to find the most productive way of doing things, the most mutually productive way of doing things. Although one of my favorite descriptions of diplomacy, which used to be applied to my cousin Crystal quite often, is the idea of the person who can tell you to go to hell but make you happy to be on your way. Everything can be presented in a positive or a negative way. Everything can help to build or help to tear down. And being mindful of how you're using those things is something not enough people practice. Um, a lot of people, and this has been very true in the pagan community, um, are not thoughtful about the conflicts that they have or why they're having them. And, I was speaking in a previous program about choosing your battles, or in other words, avoiding conflicts that you don't need, that don't benefit you. But a lot of people seem to just love being in one conflict after another. They love the emotional rush of it. And this currently is greatly afflicting our wider society. To some extent, always has. Part of it's human nature. When you're in a conflict, all of your adrenaline is going and you feel very excited and blah, blah, blah. You also very frequently destroy everything around you. There are times you must have conflict. I am never going to be that person who tells you there will never be a time for conflict. One of my favorite paraphrases is of the great writer William Baldwin, who said, "We can love each other and disagree, except, to paraphrase, when what we disagree on is my fundamental right to exist." Um, and Mary Hawke says, "But Lord High Fancy Pants insulted me." And you see that all the time. People get their emotions hurt for one reason or another and feel like they just have to do something. They never ask themselves, is this really going to benefit me? Is it going to benefit my organization? Is it going to benefit my community? Or am I just going to make a mess? Um, and when you're looking at a potential conflict, there are times it must be had. But more often than not, it's a waste of everyone's time. More often than not, there are better ways of handling it. And my advice to those who want to think of themselves as leaders is to always look for those better ways when you can do it. You can't always, but when you can, look for the diplomatic solution, look for the political solution, or ignore it, depending on what it is. Um, Someone says something that's unkind. Is there any reason you need to pay attention to that? I think it's better to ignore it most times. And hello to Zayn in the chat room. And Academy says, Albert Einstein would have said it thus: there is nothing bad, all things are just relative good. And I actually am a believer in that point of view. You'll find it not quite in those terms, but you'll find it in my writing. Um, However, the term relative good is kind of important because it's not all equally good, at least in the moment. Now, I believe very much that ultimately all things are good, but they're not necessarily good for us where we're standing. And the biggest thing that causes people and organizations and communities damage is not paying attention to what is or is not good for them, what is or is not helping them, and instead getting caught in their emotions. And I will tell you, one of the things we've been promoting recently is the Witch Wars Defense Manual, Volume 2, How to Win. One of the things I'm sure it's going to remark on is that getting people caught up in their emotions is a great way of getting them to not focus on their own interests. And you see this very strongly in US politics in the last 30 years. Constant manufactured outrage has often caused people not to look, A, at what's really happening, and B, at what is beneficial to them. It's just gotten them all in their feelings to go out and do actions dictated to them by others that they didn't really think about. And that happens in our pagan community too. That's the very nature of a witch war. Getting everybody up in their emotions to run out and take actions whose ultimate conclusions they've not thought about are not necessarily beneficial to them, though they may be beneficial to someone, and to just take those actions regardless. usually to tear some group or organization or individual apart to the benefit of someone who may or may not be visible in the equation. And it's a difficult situation to put into highly simplistic terms because there are times that there are bad actors um, who something may need to be done about. Kenny Klein would be a very big example of this. I mentioned yesterday a certain high priest in the old Chicago community whose name I will not enunciate because he's now completely forgotten, but in his day, he was a terror on the community and particularly on women in that community. And it was necessary to take a stand against his actions. But that was not a witch war. That was a real situation with real people and real events. Witch wars are usually emotional. Now, Janet says in the chat room, my feelings were recently hurt. I'm moving forward by reevaluating my own priorities. I'm still going through the emotions, but my action is to forgive both sides, but keep a guard up over my heart. And this is exactly the right thing that you should be doing, Janet. Those are very wise words. And my advice to most people would be to be like Janet. If a situation has caused you emotional pain, do not just suddenly start lashing out. Step back, think about the situation, think about what's important here, think about what you want to achieve, and continue to work on what you want in life and not get caught up in what may have hurt you. It's very easy to get caught up in emotion. Now, we're all human. We all do this from time to time. I certainly can get caught up in my emotions. Anyone can. But it's never the best policy. It's always better to think about what are you doing? Why are you doing it? And what are the results going to be? And particularly when we're talking about leadership positions, this is very important. Because whatever your emotions are, the results of the situation is what you will have to deal with. And you can deal with your emotions privately. You can't always deal with results of situations quite so privately. Now, at this point, we are about halfway through our broadcast. I'm going to take a moment for a word from our sponsors, who happen to be me at the moment, and we'll be right back. And that is our commercial for the day from Rev Don's Magic and Metaphysical Auction through Gaia Thrift Central at whatnot.com, Thursday nights at 7. So please join me this Thursday at 7 for my next metaphysical auction. Getting back to our subject of diplomacy. I have been recently watching snippets of I believe a current series called The Serpent Queen, which is about Marie de Medici. And also, I guess in season 2 involves Elizabeth I. And this, of course, is an entertainment. It's historical fiction, although I understand it's a little closer in some ways to history than some historical fictions. Although it has Marie de Medici and Elizabeth II meeting in person, or Elizabeth I meeting in person, which they certainly never did. Elizabeth II even less so. But it seems to be all about politics and diplomacy in its way, but also about emotion. Um, but I will say, and hello to Diane in the chat room. It's good to see you, Diane. It's hard for me to think of any better examples of politics and diplomacy than Elizabeth I and Marie de Medici. And exactly what I'm saying. Um, and the result of each of their different ways of handling politics is visible in their legacy and their memory. They both oversaw the end of their respective dynasties. Um, by the time that Marie de Medici died, the Valois dynasty was virtually gone. I believe it survived her by a couple of years and was succeeded by the Bourbon dynasty. By the time Elizabeth I died, the Tudor dynasty died with her and was succeeded by the Stuarts. But Elizabeth gave birth to the Elizabethan age and is remembered as one of the best monarchs that England ever had. And Marie de Medici is basically remembered as, quote, the Serpent Queen, end quote. Someone knee-deep in emotion and often disastrous choices that did not really, in the end, move forward her desires. Although it might be said that given the different circumstances between the two kingdoms, that she may have done as well as she could. France at that time may have been a little harder to govern than England, partly because Henry VIII had really dampened the English enthusiasm for rebellion, although Elizabeth still had to face a number of them. But if you look at the difference between these two women, one of the things you'll see is that Elizabeth I was constantly employing diplomacy. And she employed it in many different ways, not least of which was in her marital state. Elizabeth is famous as the Virgin Queen. Was she literally a virgin? Who knows? I don't know that anyone really much cared at the time, really. But politically speaking, she was certainly an unmarried woman. But all through her reign, until the point that she was at the very end of her life, she continued suggesting that she was considering marriage. And she used this for all kinds of diplomatic reasons, and probably avoided a number of wars in this very unusual way. Certainly avoided, I think, a number of civil wars in this unusual way. Her clothing was also entirely diplomatic. Her image was diplomatic. It was chosen to portray a certain point of view, a certain attitude, and to create a certain reaction. That too is diplomacy. All of these things are important to bear in mind if you're in a position of leadership. How you're perceived, what image you're creating, how people react to you. And a lot of people never stop to think about these things. I think that I cannot too strongly encourage anyone who is looking at a position of leadership in the pagan community or elsewhere, or who has found themselves in one, intentionally or otherwise. Pay close attention to your image. Pay close attention to how you behave in public situations. Pay close attention to your words and use them productively. Do not treat them as an accident of life. As I was saying yesterday, through most of my political life, I was extremely diplomatic by and large, until my eventual retirement as active first priest of the Corellian tradition. I'm still one of the first priesthood, but in a state of retirement, and I can be a little more blunt now. But during my years in office, I was also very aware of my words and my actions. And as a general rule, I did not allow myself to appear in public if I did not look a certain way. I did not make public commentary that I had not considered carefully. Um, that commentary generally reflected what I wanted to say, based on if I felt I should say anything. But it was said carefully. It was said um, to make sure that everything relevant was included and that it was phrased in such a way that it would be clearly understood. You know, when we're writing things, it's very easy to forget that tone of voice is not present. Back before the age of computers, when dinosaurs ruled the earth and I was young, we had something called letters that were written by hand in an old style of writing called cursive in most cases, although I usually printed mine. Um, Today, nobody remembers cursive, which is as it should be because it's really not used anymore. But in those days, when we wrote letters, it was an art form that people actually were taught. And the reason they were taught it is that everybody understood that in the absence of tone of voice, the way you use your words is more problematic because something that you don't mean to be aggressive can sound aggressive. Something that you've simply phrased in a lazy way can actually mean something different than you thought it meant. So you have to use your language carefully when you're writing. Most people have forgotten this, but the effect of it is still very much alive, and this is part of diplomacy. Particularly if you're in a leadership position, what you say and what you write will be paid attention to, and you need to be sure that you're saying what you want to be understood. And understand that even then, the meaning of the message lies with the receiver, not the sender. Therefore, as the sender, it's very important to you to make sure that your meaning is clear. Um, because chances are high you will not have the ability to speak to the receiver and tell them, oh, you misunderstood. They will simply make their assumptions. Um, these are all things to bear in mind on that subject of diplomacy. And, I would have to say today's discussion of diplomacy was a little more diplomatic than yesterday's, but these are all things to consider. And I think that my message for today is to be deliberate in your actions, your words, um, conflicts if they must occur, and not to be manipulated into things or to walk into them accidentally if you can possibly avoid it. So often in this community, people let themselves be emotionally manipulated into conflicts that they shouldn't be involved in. I've watched people throw away years of work because of an emotional situation that didn't even impact them, but they got caught in it. Um, and often you can't get that back once you've done it. I've watched people make statements, and occasionally even done it myself, particularly in earlier years, which were not understood in the way they were meant because the language was not sufficiently precise. That's how I learned to be precise in my language. Um, it's very important to pay attention to what your message is, to what you are doing in a position of leadership, or even just daily leading your own life, and not to be maneuvered into situations you don't want to be in through carelessness, through not paying attention, and through not taking the efforts you need to take in your own actions. And all of that is part of diplomacy, even though it might not be things you'd initially think of under that term. With that, I see we've come to the end of our half hour. I hope that you have enjoyed the program. I want to remind you of Rev Don's Magic and Metaphysical auction on Thursday nights at 7 at Gaia Thrift Central at whatnot.com. I want to remind you of the many interesting books we have at CorellianPublishing.com. Tomorrow, Chris Copeland will be joining me to discuss CorellianPublishing.com and the things that are new there. I want to thank all of you for joining me today. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation, and I will see you tomorrow. And with that, let us close with our prayer as we always do. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all the wonderful things you do in our life, and we ask you to help us to remain mindful of our actions, our decisions, and even our thought processes as we go forward. Help us not to be maneuvered by the emotions that others may project towards us. Help us not to be drawn into situations that we don't truly understand by the way that they're presented to us, but help us rather to make intelligent decisions that advance us in our lives. Help us to use diplomacy and good decisions to build the lives we desire. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love and thanks. May you be blessed now and always, knowing you are always with us. We thank you for your presence. And I thank you for your presence. And until tomorrow, may you blessed be.